The city lights flickered through the haze of an overcast evening as Officer Daniel Kane leaned against his patrol car, idly tapping a cigarette against his fingers. He stood on the corner of a quiet street, wearing an expression that teetered between boredom and disdain. His partner, Officer Ryan, sat inside the car scrolling through his phone, occasionally chuckling at whatever nonsense was lighting up his screen. They weren't expecting anything unusual tonight. It was supposed to be one of those uneventful shifts. But then a man appeared, walking confidently toward them, his leather briefcase tucked firmly under his arm. He looked out of place, not because he was black, although Daniel would have pretended otherwise if asked, but because of his demeanor. Tall, poised, and dressed in a sharp navy suit, the man radiated an air of authority that immediately rubbed Daniel the wrong way. Men like that didn't belong in neighborhoods like this, at least not in Daniel's eyes. The man came to a stop a few feet away, maintaining a calm but firm posture. "Officers," he greeted, his tone professional. "Good evening. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm here to finalize a property transaction nearby. Just wanted to check if the street is clear for parking overnight." Daniel squinted at him, taking a long drag of his cigarette before letting the smoke curl into the air. He didn't like the way this Marcus guy held himself, like he thought he was better than them. And something about the way he talked, so polished, so deliberate, irked him further. "You got business here, huh?" Daniel asked, a mocking edge in his voice. He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the asphalt. "Doesn't look like you're from around here." Ryan, still in the car, glanced up briefly. "Yeah, Kane," he called lazily. "Maybe Mr. Businessman here got lost on his way to Wall Street." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he opened his briefcase and pulled out a neatly organized stack of papers. "I have all the proper permits and documents for tonight's transaction. If you'd like to take a look." Daniel interrupted, snatching the papers from Marcus's hand without warning. He thumbed through them with exaggerated motions, clearly uninterested in their content. "What's this, huh? Contracts, ownership deeds, big shot stuff for someone like you." Marcus' jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Yes, those are legal documents. I'd appreciate it if you handled them carefully." Daniel laughed loud and sharp. "Oh, don't worry, I'll handle them." Then, in one swift motion, he held the stack over the flame of his lighter. The edges of the papers curled and blackened as fire consumed the neatly typed lines. "Hey," Marcus shouted, stepping forward, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "What are you doing? That's my property." But Daniel only laughed harder, holding the flaming papers high like some kind of twisted trophy. "Oops," he sneered, letting the ashes scatter in the wind. "Guess you'll have to get new ones, big guy." Ryan chuckled from inside the car but said nothing, clearly content to let Daniel take the lead. Marcus, on the other hand, stood frozen, his expression shifting from disbelief to something colder, something determined. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Marcus smoothed the lapels of his jacket, straightened his tie, and said quietly, "You'll regret that." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made Daniel pause for half a second. Only half. "Oh yeah," Daniel said, puffing out his chest. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, his briefcase swinging at his side. He didn't look back, not once. For the rest of the night, Daniel and Ryan joked about the encounter. "Did you see his face?" Ryan said, cracking open a soda can. "Priceless. He probably thinks he's gonna call some big-shot lawyer or something." Daniel smirked, flicking the end of his cigarette onto the pavement. "Let him try. People like that don't scare me." The two officers continued their shift without a second thought, unaware that Marcus Reed wasn't just some businessman. He wasn't just a guy with a briefcase full of papers. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Marcus was set to become their new precinct captain in less than 24 hours. And when he walked through those station doors the next morning, wearing that same sharp navy suit and carrying another briefcase, he wasn't going to forget a single detail of what had happened. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with its usual rhythm. Officers shuffling papers, dispatch calls crackling over radios, and the faint aroma of burnt coffee wafting through the air. Daniel sauntered into the station, his uniform slightly wrinkled, with a cocky grin plastered on his face. Last night's encounter had already faded to the back of his mind. To him, it was just another instance of putting someone in their place. He grabbed a stale donut from the break room counter and leaned against the doorframe, chatting aimlessly with Ryan, who was nursing his third cup of coffee. "What do you think that guy's up to now?" Ryan asked, smirking over the rim of his mug. "Still trying to glue those ashes back together." Daniel snorted. probably crying to his lawyer or writing a letter to the mayor. People like him always think they can outsmart the system. He took a large bite of the donut, brushing crumbs off his uniform. But the system doesn't care. Before Ryan could reply, the sound of a sharp, purposeful voice cut through the hum of the precinct. "Attention, everyone. Line up." The room stilled as officers turned toward the entrance. A tall man in a pristine suit strode in, his every step measured and deliberate. Marcus Reed's presence filled the room immediately, and his voice carried an authority that demanded obedience. A few officers exchanged puzzled looks, but they all shuffled into a line, murmuring amongst themselves. Daniel froze mid-bite, the donut still in his hand. His stomach twisted as recognition dawned on him. It couldn't be. Not here. Not him. But as Marcus' eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Daniel before moving on, it became painfully clear that this wasn't some coincidence. Marcus set his briefcase on the desk at the front of the room, flipping it open with a practiced efficiency. Without glancing up, he said, "My name is Marcus Reed, your new precinct captain. I expect professionalism, accountability, and results from each and every one of you. This isn't a game, gentlemen. If you're not up to the standards of this department, you won't last under my command." The room fell silent, save for the faint creak of chairs as officers shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's palms began to sweat, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a prick of uncertainty. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected from someone he had humiliated just hours before. Marcus continued, his tone firm but controlled. "There are changes coming. Effective immediately, this precinct will operate under stricter guidelines. Accountability will be non-negotiable. Every action you take, every decision you make in that uniform, reflects on this department and on me." His eyes swept the line again, and this time they settled on Daniel. "Officer Kane," Marcus said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Marcus' lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "We'll be having a private discussion later. I trust you'll make yourself available." "Yes, sir," Daniel muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good." Marcus closed the briefcase with a decisive snap and turned back to the rest of the room. "Now let's get to work." As the officers dispersed, whispers erupted like wildfire. No one knew much about Marcus Reed, but his sudden appointment as precinct captain was enough to spark speculation. Some said he was a former prosecutor with a reputation for dismantling corruption. Others claimed he had ties to powerful people in city politics. Regardless of the truth, one thing was clear. Marcus wasn't here to make friends. Daniel retreated to his desk, his mind racing. What kind of game was this? Why hadn't Marcus mentioned last night's incident directly? Was this some kind of power play, or was he waiting to drop the hammer later? For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Ryan leaned over, lowering his voice. "What's his deal? Do you know him or something?" Daniel hesitated. "Not really," he lied. "Just ran into him last night on patrol. Guy seemed uptight." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Uptight enough to get promoted to captain overnight? Come on, man, spill it." "I don't know," Daniel snapped, a little too harshly. He immediately regretted it, but Ryan just shrugged and backed off, muttering something under his breath about Daniel's mood swings. Throughout the day, Daniel couldn't focus. Every time Marcus passed by, his heart rate spiked. It wasn't just fear, it was frustration. He had spent years building his reputation in this precinct, carefully towing the line between authority and arrogance. Now, with Marcus in charge, all of that felt like it was hanging by a thread. When the clock struck 5, Marcus called out from his office door. "Officer Kane." A word. Daniel stood, straightening his uniform as best he could, and walked toward the captain's office. Every step felt heavier than the last. He entered the room, closing the door behind him, and stood at attention, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Marcus didn't look up right away. He was reviewing a file on his desk, flipping through pages with a deliberate slowness that made Daniel's skin crawl. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, fixing Daniel with an unwavering stare. "Officer Kane," Marcus began, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You and I had an interesting encounter last night, didn't we?" Daniel's mouth went dry. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Marcus interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't need excuses or explanations. What I need is honesty. Are you capable of that?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. Marcus leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Good, then let's start with this. Do you believe your actions last night represented the values of this department?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his behavior, but the weight of Marcus's gaze pinned him in place. "No, sir," he admitted finally. Marcus nodded as though he had expected nothing less. "I appreciate your honesty, but let me be clear. What you did last night wasn't just unprofessional. It was unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on this entire precinct." Daniel felt a surge of anger bubbling beneath his fear. Who did this guy think he was, coming in here and passing judgment like he was some kind of saint? "With all due respect, sir," Daniel said, striving to keep his tone even. "It was a small mistake. It's not like anyone got hurt." Marcus' expression didn't change. "You're right. No one got hurt this time. But mistakes like yours have a way of snowballing, Officer Kane. Today, it's a stack of papers. Tomorrow, it could be someone's life." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't expect you to agree with me," Marcus said. "Frankly, I don't care if you do. What I care about is whether you can take responsibility for your actions and learn from them. Can you do that, Officer Kane?" Daniel hesitated again, his pride warring with his survival instincts. "Yes, sir," he said finally, his voice tight. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, that will be all for now. Dismissed." Daniel turned and left the office, his mind a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and unease. He didn't know what game Marcus Ray was playing, but one thing was certain. It was far from over. As the days passed, the atmosphere at the precinct shifted dramatically. Marcus Reed's presence was like a spotlight, exposing cracks that had long been ignored. He introduced a slew of new protocols, accountability logs, stricter documentation for arrests, and mandatory community outreach programs. The officers grumbled, of course, but Marcus didn't seem to care. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to make changes, and Daniel felt the weight of those changes more than anyone. At first, Daniel tried to ignore Marcus. He kept his head down, did his patrols, and avoided interactions with the new captain whenever possible. But it didn't take long for him to realize that Marcus wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. Every time Daniel cut corners or made a questionable judgment call, Marcus was there watching. He didn't yell or reprimand publicly. He didn't need to. His quiet disapproval was far more effective, gnawing at Daniel's nerves like a slow-burning fire. One afternoon, Daniel found himself on patrol with Officer Ryan. They were cruising through a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. Daniel's mood was sour, as it often was these days. He still hadn't figured out what Marcus' endgame was, and the uncertainty was driving him crazy. "You've been off your game lately," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "You okay?" Daniel shot him a sharp look. "I'm fine." Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying. You've been different since Raid showed up, like you're walking on eggshells." "Maybe I am," Daniel muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Guy's got it out for me." Ryan chuckled. "Join the club. He's got it out for everyone. That's what happens when you bring in an outsider to clean house." Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's scrutiny was personal, not just part of some broader effort to reform the precinct. And the more he thought about it, the more it ate at him. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from dispatch, a domestic disturbance a few blocks away. They arrived at the scene to find a young woman standing on the front lawn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked upset but not panicked, which was a relief. Daniel stepped out of the car and approached her. "Ma'am, can you tell us what's going on?" "It's my boyfriend," she said, her voice shaky but controlled. "He's been drinking, and he started yelling at me. I didn't feel safe." Daniel nodded, glancing toward the house. "Is he still inside?" "Yes," she said, "in the living room." Daniel turned to Ryan. "Stay with her. I'll handle this." He walked up to the front door, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He dealt with situations like this dozens of times before, and they rarely escalated. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind, the sense that Marcus would be scrutinizing his every move if he were here. The boyfriend turned out to be belligerent but not dangerous. Daniel diffused the situation quickly, convincing the man to step outside and talk things over calmly. By the time they left the scene, the woman seemed relieved, and the boyfriend had agreed to take a walk to cool off. Back at the precinct, Daniel filled out the incident report with practiced efficiency. But as he was wrapping up, he noticed Marcus watching him from across the room. Their eyes met briefly before Marcus turned and walked into his office. The message was clear. Marcus was paying attention, and Daniel's every move was under a microscope. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The tension at work was bad enough, but what really bothered him was the sense that Marcus had some kind of plan, something Daniel couldn't see coming. He thought about their first encounter, the way Marcus had stood there, calm and unshaken, even as Daniel burned his documents. It didn't add up. No one reacted like that unless they were holding all the cards. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the precinct early, determined to get ahead of whatever Marcus had planned. But as he walked through the doors, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. A group of civilians was gathered in the lobby, holding signs that read things like "Justice for All" and "End Police Corruption." At the center of the group was Marcus, speaking calmly to a reporter with a camera crew in tow. Daniel's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard anything about a protest, let alone one happening right here at the precinct. He watched from the sidelines as Marcus addressed the reporter, his voice steady and authoritative. "This department is committed to transparency and accountability," Marcus said. "We welcome the community's input and encourage constructive dialogue. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes as Marcus spoke. Daniel felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just about reforming the precinct. This was about Marcus making a name for himself, using the department as a stepping stone for his own ambitions. When the interview ended and the protesters began to disperse, Marcus walked back into the precinct, his expression as composed as ever. He glanced at Daniel briefly before heading to his office, leaving Daniel stewing in frustration. Over the next few days, the tension between Daniel and Marcus continued to build. Daniel found himself second-guessing his every move, wondering how Marcus would perceive it. Meanwhile, Marcus remained as inscrutable as ever, his calm demeanor masking whatever plans he had in motion. And then, one evening, Daniel received a call from an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, but something compelled him to pick up. "Officer Kane," the voice on the other end said, smooth and measured. "I think we need to talk." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "You'll find out soon enough," the voice replied. "Let's just say I have information that could change everything. For you, for Marcus Reed, and for this entire precinct. Meet me at the old diner on 5th Street, midnight." The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. He didn't know who the caller was or what they wanted, but one thing was certain. The game had just taken a new turn, and the stakes were higher than ever. Daniel sat in his car outside the diner, his fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. The faint glow of the neon sign above the entrance flickered in the dark, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move like living things. He had been sitting there for nearly 15 minutes, debating whether to go inside. The caller's voice had been calm but unsettling, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But curiosity, and a nagging sense of self-preservation, had driven him here. Whoever this person was, they claimed to have information that could change everything, and Daniel couldn't afford to ignore that. Finally, he took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped out into the cool night air. As he approached the diner, he scanned the windows for any sign of the mystery caller. The place looked empty, save for an older man sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. Daniel pushed the door open, and a bell jingled softly above him. The man behind the counter glanced up briefly, then returned to wiping down the surface with a stained rag. "You're late," a voice said from the corner booth. Daniel turned sharply to see a figure seated in the shadows. He couldn't make out much beyond the man's silhouette, but the voice was unmistakable. It was the same one that had called him earlier. Slowly, Daniel walked over and slid into the booth across from the man, his every nerve on edge. "You've got a lot of nerve calling me," Daniel said, keeping his voice low. "Who are you, and what do you want?" The man leaned forward slightly, and Daniel could finally see his face. He was younger than Daniel had expected, maybe in his early 30s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he were enjoying Daniel's discomfort. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows things," the man said, folding his hands on the table. "Things about you, about Marcus Reed, and about this precinct." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "If you're wasting my time, I'm not," the man interrupted smoothly. "In fact, I think you'll find what I have to say very enlightening." There was something about the man's tone that set Daniel's teeth on edge. He didn't trust him, not for a second, but he couldn't walk away now. Not when the man clearly knew something important. "Go on," Daniel said reluctantly. The man smirked, as if he just won some unspoken game. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table to Daniel. "This," he said, "is everything you need to know about Marcus Reed. where he's been, what he's done, and, most importantly, why he's here. Daniel opened the folder cautiously, his eyes scanning the documents inside. At first, it was hard to make sense of what he was looking at. Records of financial transactions, emails, and photographs. But as he pieced it together, a picture began to emerge, and it wasn't one he liked. "Raid's not here to clean up the precinct," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "He's here to settle a score. You think his little reform act is about accountability? Think again. This is personal." Daniel's stomach churned as he flipped through the documents. According to the files, Marcus had been involved in a controversial case years ago, one that had nearly ended his career. The case had involved police misconduct, and though Marcus hadn't been directly implicated, he'd been vocal about the need for reform. That had made him enemies, both within the department and outside it. And now, it seemed, he was using his new position to exact some kind of twisted justice. "You're lying," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" the man replied, leaning back in his seat. "Think about it. Why else would someone like Marcus Reed, with his spotless record and glowing reputation, take a job at a place like this? It's a dead-end post for someone like him. Unless, of course, he had a reason." Daniel didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fit. Marcus' relentless scrutiny, his refusal to back down, even in the face of resistance. It all made sense if he had a personal vendetta. "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked finally, his voice tight with anger. "Simple," the man said. "I want you to take him down. Expose him for what he really is. All you have to do is leak this information to the right people, and Marcus Reed's career will be over." Daniel stared at the man, his mind racing. If what he was saying was true, then Marcus wasn't the hero he claimed to be. But something about this didn't sit right. The man was too smooth, too eager to throw Marcus under the bus. And then there was the question of why he'd come to Daniel, of all people. "What's in it for you?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have my reasons. Marcus Reed's downfall benefits me, but it benefits you too. Think about it. You get to clear your name, prove that he's been targeting you unfairly. It's a win-win." Daniel didn't respond. He closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I'll think about it," he said, standing up. The man's smile faded slightly, but he nodded. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. The longer Marcus stays in power, the more damage he'll do." Daniel left the diner without another word, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The man's story had been compelling, but it felt too convenient, too perfectly tailored to exploit Daniel's frustrations. And yet, the evidence in the folder had seemed real. If there was even a chance that Marcus had ulterior motives, didn't Daniel have a duty to find out the truth? As he drove home, Daniel's thoughts kept circling back to Marcus. He couldn't shake the image of the man standing in the precinct lobby, speaking to the reporter with that calm, confident air. Was it all an act? Or was the stranger at the diner playing his own game, using Daniel as a pawn? By the time Daniel pulled into his driveway, he was no closer to an answer. But one thing was certain, he couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. The stakes were too high, and the truth, whatever it was, demanded to be uncovered. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, his mind still tangled in the mess of doubts and revelations from the night before. The folder's contents weighed heavily on him, like a stone he couldn't put down. He kept telling himself he needed more time to process everything, but deep down he knew the clock was ticking. Marcus Reed wasn't just the boss now. He was a man with power, connections, and a mission that could crush anyone in his path. If the stranger's words were true, then Marcus wasn't just a threat to the precinct. He was a threat to anyone who dared to oppose him. The precinct was eerily quiet that morning, with only the hum of the coffee machine and the occasional shuffle of papers breaking the silence. Daniel made his way to his desk, careful not to draw attention. He decided to spend the day looking into the claims made by the stranger. If there was a trail to follow, he'd find it, quietly, without tipping anyone off. As he opened his computer, an email notification popped up. The subject line sent a jolt through him, i.e., ongoing investigation, confidential. It was from an internal affairs officer he'd spoken to months ago, back when Marcus had first arrived. The message was cryptic but clear. They wanted to meet in person immediately. Daniel's pulse quickened. Why now? He hadn't reached out to EA in weeks, and yet here they were, suddenly pulling him into a meeting. It didn't feel like a coincidence. He shut down his computer, grabbed his jacket, and headed out, muttering an excuse to the nearest colleague about needing to check in on a personal matter. The meeting spot was an unremarkable cafe a few blocks away, chosen no doubt for its anonymity. As Daniel walked in, he scanned the room, his eyes landing on a woman sitting in the corner. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and gave a small nod. "Detective Grant," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Thanks for coming on such short notice." Daniel sat down, his guard immediately up. "What's this about? I thought the investigation was closed." The woman leaned forward, lowering her voice. "It was, but new information has come to light. Information that concerns your precinct and your new captain." Daniel's chest tightened. "What kind of information?" The woman hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. Then she slid a file across the table to him. "I don't know how much you've been paying attention, but Captain Reed's transfer wasn't as routine as it appeared. There were irregularities." Daniel opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. What he saw made his blood run cold. The documents detailed a series of backdoor dealings involving Marcus and several high-ranking officials. It appeared that Marcus had leveraged a personal connection to secure his position at the precinct, specifically a connection to a prominent figure with a vested interest in the precinct's operations. "You're telling me he was planted here?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded. "Planted, yes, but it's worse than that. We believe he's working to dismantle the precinct from within, targeting officers he deems problematic. And from what we've gathered, you're at the top of his list." Daniel's stomach dropped. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of dread through him. "Why me?" "Your record," the woman said simply. "You've got a reputation for being uncooperative when it comes to bending the rules. That makes you a liability to someone like him." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So what am I supposed to do? You're AIA. Aren't you supposed to handle this?" The woman shook her head. "Not officially. If we move too soon, we risk tipping him off, and he's got powerful allies. What we need is someone on the inside, someone who can gather evidence without raising suspicion." Daniel's jaw clenched. "And you want me to be that someone?" "It's the only way," she said. "If we can prove he's acting in bad faith, we can take him down. But we need your help." Daniel sat in silence, weighing his options. On one hand, working with IA could give him the leverage he needed to fight back against Marcus. On the other hand, it put him in an even more dangerous position. If Marcus found out, there was no telling what he'd do. As if sensing his hesitation, the woman added, "I know this is a lot to ask, but you're not alone in this. We've got your back." Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they did little to ease Daniel's anxiety. He nodded stiffly, then stood up. "I'll think about it," he said, echoing the same words he used with the stranger at the diner. As he walked back to the precinct, Daniel's mind raced. The stakes had just been raised, and the web of lies and deceit surrounding Marcus' raid was growing more tangled by the minute. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore. If he didn't act, Marcus would destroy him, and possibly the entire precinct, with impunity. When he returned to his desk, Daniel found another surprise waiting for him. A sealed envelope sat on top of his keyboard, unmarked except for his name scrawled across the front. He glanced around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. Carefully, he opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was short and chilling. "We know you've been asking questions. Stop, or there will be consequences." Daniel's heart pounded as he reread the note. The message was clear. Someone was watching him, and they didn't want him digging any deeper. But what they didn't know was that the note only strengthened his resolve. Whoever was behind this had just made one crucial mistake. They underestimated him. Slipping the note into his pocket, Daniel made a silent vow to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. But one thing was certain. Daniel Grant wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever.